So as we go through tonight's topic, just understand that if I mention brand names or trade names or anything like that, it's not meant to be necessarily an endorsement. Myself nor the university endorses, nor are we disparaging any similar product that may not be mentioned. It's just an example to help with communication and help us have something to point to and relate to. So cover crops in home vegetable gardens. I wanted to do this topic because this is one that I think a lot of gardeners could possibly look at doing something new. Okay? And so a lot of what I try to do with these classes is introduce you to something that you maybe haven't done before, not so much do it better, but just get you started. And lots of times when I talk to home gardeners, they're not doing any sort of cover cropping. And I think that's a negative, but I think it's just a lack of familiarity. So what is a cover crop? When we're talking about cover crops, you'll sometimes hear the phrase green manure used interchangeably. And so it's a crop that we're growing, but we're not actually harvesting it. It's not something we're going to be eating or consuming, but we're actually growing it. Typically, we think of these as improving the soil or some sort of larger ecological impact. We see that cover cropping is closely associated with regenerative, sustainable, organic gardening and agriculture. So it's not anything unusual, really. But I do think it's something that's gaining importance and gaining attention, both for commercial operations, but also for home gardeners. We might even think of cover cropping as sort of composting in place, because essentially those beneficial things that we have happening in the compost pile of organic matter breaking down, it's kind of taking place in the garden. So in a way, we can sort of think of this as composting in place with some plants. We like to use cover crops because they do a number of different things really well for us in the garden. One of the first things they do and that we really like is they scavenge nutrients. So if you have fertilized this season, you're going to have some nutrients there that are probably available to plants whenever we get frost that shows up, whenever our plants stop growing. And while maybe there's some winter annual weeds growing there, if we don't have something to grab those nutrients, worst case scenario, we paid money for something that's now lost because we can lose it through the movement of water, or if we have erosion happening when soil particles move, we can lose fertility. So we don't want to lose that, but it does have a negative impact on things like water quality. So having something there living to scavenge those nutrients is a huge benefit. It does protect our soils from erosion. Cover crops are armor for our soils. It reduces particles being dislodged by raindrops falling. It adds organic matter to our soils. It can add nitrogen depending on what species we're growing. We'll talk more about that. And that's directly referencing legumes and rhizobium bacteria. It competes with weeds. So rather than having those winter annual weeds like chickweed and others growing in our garden, we're going to have something that maybe is doing a little bit more for us. Certainly, they can be a pollinator planting, especially if we're using them in the main season. We're looking at flowering types that have floral resources for pollinators, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It improves soil structure. And so when we have plant roots going through the soil and just basically helping the biology of the soil, increasing our bacteria, our fungi, it is improving soil structure. And that means air and water has more spaces in the soil, and it's easier for both of those to get into the soil, both of which benefit plants. The other thing that I like about cover crops, and this is really good when you're limited on space, it sort of functions as a rotation crop. So you always hear me talking when I'm doing a talk on vegetable gardening that you want to rotate your crops whenever possible. So don't follow plant families one after the other. We want to do that to reduce the buildup of diseases or carryover diseases. And even looking at, some of the fertility side, different crops have different nutrient requirements. So maybe we're not depleting certain things as quickly. That's hard to do when you have limited space, especially if there's just a handful of crops you grow. When we use a cover crop, it kind of gives us another plant family typically or at least we can certainly select for different plant families. And that allows us to get that function of a rotation crop without losing productivity during the main season. So any one of these would be a good reason to use cover crops. The fact that they all come in the same package, I think is pretty amazing for us. We can do cover crops on a very small scale. So what you see on the screen is actually a buckwheat cover crop that was in a raised bed this summer. This was at the Lincoln Park here in Jonesboro at the vegetable garden that our master gardeners here in Washington County assist the senior center with. And so we had a spot that had some early cool season stuff. It was done. Wasn't quite time to plant some later things. So we planted buckwheat. Real quick crop. We'll talk about it in a minute. But this was just half of a raised bed. So it's 4 feet by 4 feet. We had a nice big patch of buckwheat. I like to talk on this slide about sometimes the well-intended, if slightly misinformation that's out there. If you look at a lot of garden resources and they talk about having plantings for pollinators, having floral resources for them, they always say, plant flowers in your garden. It will attract beneficial insects. It will attract pollinators. Very true. But the more true statement is it attracts all insects, including pollinators, beneficials, but also even some bad folks. Now, I'm not trying to dissuade you from planting these, but we have there in the upper right-hand corner with the label cut off, a spotted lady beetle. It's a pink lady beetle with black spots. It's elongated. It's not round. If you've ever seen those in your garden, that's a good guy. What's neat about them is when they don't have enough aphids or things like that to eat, they'll actually eat pollen. Pollen is a protein source. So it was on my buckwheat flowers eating pollen. I don't mind at all. Happy to have it in the garden. Below it, though, you see a 2-line spittlebug. Spittlebugs are not our friends. They're a negative one. We wouldn't want those in the garden. We certainly aren't trying to attract them. The reality is when we have pollinator plantings or things like that, we'll have all kinds of insects in there. If you have cabbage looper butterflies, those white moths, actually more correctly, that are out there flying around and laying the eggs that are those little green caterpillars that are eating all your brassicas, if you have flowers and you're out there in the garden, you can watch them land on flowers, drink some nectar, and then go fly around some more and lay eggs somewhere. So I'm not telling you not to have floral resources or not to have pollinator plantings. I just don't want to say the statement, it's great for pollinators and beneficials without being fully truthful and say it's great for all insects, including maybe some we want. What we like about pollinator or refuge plantings is hopefully it gives us that balance, that if it does have, if we do have in our garden some negative insects, some bad guys, we also have some positive insects, the beneficials that are predators that can actually take advantage and use those bad guys for their benefit. So I just don't want to present this as one-sided where if you plant flowers, it's all rosy. Truth is, these are plants just like everything else. And sometimes we see insects that we might not like to see exploiting those resources. This is another example. When I first moved to Northeast Tennessee, I was in an apartment. We had a little 4x4 spot outside of the apartment. Over the winter, I did a winter wheat and Austrian winter pea mix. And so this is probably in March-ish, late March, maybe early April. We've got a lot of growth there, a lot of biomass, which is just to say plant material there. And you can see it's a mix of grassy stuff. That's winter wheat. And then the stuff that looks kind of like sweet peas or garden peas, that's your Austrian winter pea. It's a type of field pea. So you don't have to have large areas. You can try this on a small area. And I'll give you a sneak peek of what's to come. In the right-hand photo, you see in the upper left-hand corner of it, a spade getting ready to chop and turn that under. So it doesn't take equipment either. So if you think you have raised beds, I don't have a tiller, this isn't something I can do, you still may have some options there. And we'll talk about that. Oh, wrong button. There we go. Real quickly, because we talk so much about cover crops in concert with soil health, I just want to mention a few things, 3 points on soil health, really. One, when we talk about soil health, we're talking about microbial abundance and health. So healthy soils are those that have a thriving soil biology. And so what's good about having cover crops growing in any plants, living plant roots exude different things. And so it's things like simple sugars, amino acids, which the microbes will feed on. So when we have plants growing, we're actually literally feeding that biological community. The plants are doing it because it gives a benefit to the plants. Those are the same microbes that are breaking down organic matter or acting on soil minerals to make them more available. So it's a benefit to the plant to do this. It's not a one-way street. But we get there by having a healthy soil, and a healthy soil is really saying healthy microbes, and plants growing is one way to do it. We never want to see our soils bare. And so the best option is a living plant cover. When we can't have living plants, we can do an organic mulch. And when I'm using the word organic, all of this is saying is something that either is alive or was alive, so like plant debris, or it came from something that was alive, like manure from animals. And so that's not about a production method or anything like that. That's organic in the chemical sense. Third point, we want to always preserve organic matter, and we want to add organic matter anytime we get the opportunity. So one of the best ways we can do this is minimizing tillage. There's other reasons we'll talk about towards the end why we wouldn't use tillage. It has some negative things, but it's also a tool that sometimes is useful. But we do want to try to minimize tillage whenever we have the option. So if we are growing living plants and we're maximizing that organic matter by preserving it, we're going to have healthier soil biology, and healthier soils mean healthier, more productive plants. And that's really what this is all about. One thing that I always think you need to walk into the decision process of cover cropping is how are you going to kill it, or termination, as we say in context to cover crops. Because what you're willing to do, what you're able to do, is going to ultimately decide which crop you should pick. There's no one single cover crop that is the best always in every situation. Different ones have different strengths and weaknesses. And what your goal out of them, that can change one higher or the other as a better option. The good thing about when it comes to termination of these crops, we do have a lot of options. Some are better than others for certain species, and some of them are very sensitive about timing. So it might work, but it's a process that requires you to wait later than you would like to kill the crop. And so that might mean you have a slower time getting started with your vegetable garden in spring. So timing is important for some of these, and we'll mention that later, but just understand there is more than one way to kill these. And so often we can find a good option that works with your goals and your resources. Some of the ways we can kill these, and this would not be necessarily an exhaustive list, but we can use herbicide in certain scenarios. We can allow winter kill to happen. So just we plant a crop that isn't going to survive our winter weather. Crimping is something we can do. It's done a lot on a larger scale for farms, may not be the best for gardens because of timing. Using a mower or a string trimmer just to cut them down, or any other way to cut them down, is often beneficial and a good option. Tillage can be used. So whether we're doing that by hand with a spade or a shovel, just turning things over, or even a broad fork, or whether we use an actual rototiller machine, either of those can be very viable. In some scenarios, pulling can be good. The one thing I don't like about pulling is I like if we can leave more of the roots in the ground, just because as they break down, that just gives you more pathways for flowing water and things like that. But even pulling can work, and it's not necessarily a bad thing if that's the best option for your scenario. And the other thing that I don't have a lot of experience with, but gets a lot of attention online, is tarping, or if we're using the more technical term, occultation, which basically just means covering it up so light doesn't reach it. That can be an option as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But again, the best one is the one that works well for you, both in what you have available to accomplish it with, but also the timing. Typically, we want to allow about 2 to 3 weeks between termination and planting or sowing. We do that so that cover crop can start breaking down some of those nutrients can start becoming available. Does that mean if you have less time than that, what you're planting won't grow? No. There's flexibility there, but ideally we'd like 2 to 3 weeks for most methods to allow for some of that decomposition and microbial growth to start happening. So herbicides, it might surprise some people to mention the herbicides just because as a general rule, we want to be super careful about how we use herbicides around our gardens. And still the case here, but what is surprising to folks is, so this is a formulation in this instance of Roundup, and Roundup is just a advertising name. It's a product line, not just a singular product, but typically they're glyphosate. And depending on the exact formulation, they're glyphosate mixed with some other herbicides in certain instances. And certainly for this Concentrate Plus product, it is glyphosate, and then it is diquat, if I remember correctly. What's interesting about this product is it's actually labeled for homeowners to use it for establishing gardens. And so I pulled there underneath the picture of that front label, you can see the second bullet point that 3 days after application, we can actually be planting vegetables, fruits, grasses, or herbs. So this is a product that even though it does a great job at killing plants it's applied to, whether intentionally or unintentionally, if we're not doing a good job when we're using it, it doesn't last long in the environment. And so we can actually use this to kill a cover crop. We can use this whenever we're starting to establish a garden in an area, because again, it's got a very short replant period. There are some Roundup products, other companies make glyphosate products that would not be the case because they would have an additional herbicide in them that would have a much longer residual activity period. But this particular product, and the reason we know that is we read the label. Don't ever utilize herbicides or really any sort of pesticide without reading that label fully and understanding how to use it in your situation. The label is always the law. And so make sure we do that. But absolutely, herbicides are an option for killing cover crops, and particularly when we have limitations, whether with physically or with equipment, where it's not practical to do it by hand. And so having an option that maybe takes some of the physical labor out is ideal for your situation. Another one that works well, and this works well for many different cover crops, is cutting and incorporation. And so there's more than one way to do this. We can do it by hand, and on a small scale, it works great. You know, a 4x4 garden spot, a couple of beds, you can do it by hand and not worry about it. Probably not going to do a half acre this way. That would be a little tiresome, I think. But basically, you cut it so you can do that with all the sort of hand implements I have listed there. You could mow it. You can use the string trimmer, however you want to do it. And then basically, you then either use tillage or you're turning over the soil by hand. You don't necessarily have to go really deep. I'm not talking about tilling 6 or 8 inches. You could if you wanted to, but basically when I use a spade to do something like this, I'm probably going down 3 inches or less. I'm basically just wanting to cut through the crowns or the top of the root systems of what's planted there, and then I'll just flip the soil over. So this isn't trying to turn over a deep, large amount of soil. This is just trying to disrupt that root system, because a lot of these crops, depending on when you cut them, will regrow. So you don't want to just mow these or use a weed eater to cut them, plant something into them, and have them jump back, because these will regrow quickly because they have a nice big root system they've been growing. Like for instance, with winter wheat, since you planted it in the fall. And so if you're trying to plant early spring things and you just mow it down and then it starts to regrow, you've got a weed now and no longer a cover crop because it's in direct competition with your vegetables. So I like cutting it somehow, size appropriate, kind of depends what method I'm going to use, and then working the top couple inches of soil to disrupt those root systems and make sure I'm actually killing that plant. this is the one that works best. You can use a rototiller to do this. And depending on how much biomass, how much living plant matter you have above the soil, you may not have to cut it. But if you've got a lot, you may have to cut it first before you rototill it. And even then, sometimes it can clog up rototillers if you have a lot of biomass you're trying to turn under. Crimping or rolling and crimping, you'll hear it described different ways, works really well on a number of different grains particularly, but other species as well. However, it is extremely sensitive to when you do it. What you're literally doing is you're kind of breaking the stem or the stalk of that plant in multiple places. On the left, you see the commercial agriculture version of it. You have what's called a chevron roller, where you have plates sticking off of a cylinder. The cylinder gets filled with water to add more weight to it. And basically you pull it over top of your cover crop. And as those blades are hitting the stem, it's crushing it. And that's disrupting that vascular system. If you do this at the right time, the plant's not going to regrow. So typically for rolling and crimping, you're doing this at least when it's in flower, if not when it's starting to go to seed. For grains in particular, you're doing at the milk stage, which is whenever they do have a seed head on them, it's beginning to form. If you actually start squeezing it, you can actually get a milk-like liquid out of the individual grains. So it's before it starts to set. Again, for us, that's probably late April-ish for a lot of grains. We do a lot of vegetable gardening before April, or at least we have the option. So this is one that's not necessarily timed well for a lot of gardeners. We don't have to have the big equipment. If you do, awesome. There's a homeowner way of doing it, or a small scale way, where you just take an angle iron, attach it to a 2x6, 2x8, put a rope through the board so you have a handle, and you just kind of crush it as you walk down through it. So you can actually do this by hand, and this will actually work if the timing is right. But it is physical, and the timing is very sensitive again. So not necessarily the best, but I think one that's interesting, and certainly depending on your scenario, might be a good fit for you. What's great about it, you've just left all that biomass on the surface of the soil as a mulch. So if you've heard me talk about vegetable gardenings, I love mulch and vegetable gardenings. So this is a great way to do it, but the timing sometimes stinks for us. And so that's the limitations, I think, of crimping. Tarping, this is one that I think can work. I think there's less research out there about it. This is used a lot by a lot of small, like farmers market type growers, especially in the organic realm. I think it works well for them. What always makes me scratch my head is I don't like anything that reduces water or air infiltration in the soil. And when you have these tarps or other heavy covers in place for several weeks at a time, you are doing that. I don't think it's the end of the world. I think it's, again, used to good effect, but that's always something that always is in the back of my mind. Is this the best for our soil biology? I don't think it's a critical no-no. That's why I'm more than willing to talk about it here. Lots of times what happens is you'll actually do some sort of mechanical action to reduce the volume of that crop so it's crushed down. Rolling and crimping can be well, mowing it somehow again, and then you tarp it or you cover it. Lots of times it's recommended to use silage tarps. If you're familiar with dairy farms and their silage bunks, it's because they're very heavy duty. They'll last for multiple seasons. It probably would not be the best choice to use a very cheap tarp that you might get somewhere. It may not be thick enough to actually fully block the sun. So that's important. You could maybe use other materials, especially like on a bed, if you had metal roofing or something like that. Again, this is occultation, which is basically blocking the sunlight. And so you're doing this for at least a couple or 3 weeks. And so it can be effective. But again, depending on your size and scale, this might be a good option for you. Again, with this, we're not doing any sort of cultivation of the soil in this instance. And so that's a good thing, because I said earlier, we want to minimize tillage. So that would be a positive aspect of this one. And one reason why, excuse me, growers that are wanting to do minimum tillage are really looking at utilizing it. We can also allow nature to kill our crops for us. The challenge with that is that we are in a transition zone, and I'll mention this again later. So, we're sort of in between the northern or the southern environments. So we kind of get by with a lot of things. The joke always is we can't grow cold things well or hot things, either one. We grow them both kind of moderately. And that's probably sometimes a little true, but what that means is some things that we could say definitely will winter kill if we were in the northern part of the US, we can't say that. Sometimes they might get killed here, sometimes might not. And so that makes them a little bit challenging if you're betting or counting on them to winter kill, and they don't. Because if they survive, now we got weeds, because again, they're going to be growing in competition with what we want to grow. So just understand that if you are planting something that you hope to winter kill, now buckwheat will absolutely winter kill every time. Oats probably should winter kill most winters. There probably have been winters when they could have snuck by. Generally speaking, a lot of your mustards, turnips, radishes will winter kill. There's been occasionally a winter where you could see where someone had sown like fall turnips just for like human consumption for themselves out of their garden. And very early spring, you start seeing a lot of yellow flowers out there where the turnips survived. So it can happen. So again, that's why I kind of bump most of these down. Basically, if it's a warm season option, we can say it reliably winter kills. So that last bullet I probably should put up there under buckwheat. So we certainly can grow some things in the fall knowing, hey, this isn't going to last all winter. They're not going to reach full maturity, but we can plant a lot of warm season stuff and just have them kill out when winter kills them. Generally speaking, when we're talking about things that winter kill, we want them have them planted in the garden as early as possible. So most of the time we're looking at somewhere mid to late August or earlier mid-September. It's just because we want them to grow more now, so they're producing more biomass, pumping more good resources into the soil through their roots before they get killed. And so we plant these earlier than we might the ones that are overwintering for us. So just be aware of that. Things don't always go according to plan. So this was actually, I found an example from NRCS in Iowa. This was like a half-acre trial they did with a farmer where they actually did winter pea. They didn't specify which one, and there are different ones out there. So I just left it as winter pea and a rye mix that they then rolled. And I assume that they crimped it as well. Rolling alone wouldn't kill rye for sure. And at least in parts of the field, the winter peas did not get killed from the crimping. So either the timing was off with their flowering or the equipment wasn't heavy enough or something. In fact, in the center of that picture, you'll kind of pick out some corn plants that are growing. You see a lot of straw stuff. That's the rye that did get killed. But all the green stuff there, those are pea plants. If you look kind of above the UT Extension logo, you can actually maybe pick out some of those pea pods sitting there. So it flowered, they seeded, and so now we've got a plant. So now, I mean, you can obviously come into something like this where you have a broadleaf weed in a grass crop like corn. You've got some herbicide options. They can deal with this, but this is what can go wrong sometimes. And so that's why having something, a method like cutting and incorporation might be better to use, simply because it pretty much isn't going to fail often. It's going to do its job. So sometimes things don't go according to plan. So always kind of think of, if this didn't work, what would I do to address it? I told you before, avoid tillage. It's not good. It burns through our organic matter. Basically, it literally chops up organic matter. Smaller particles are more easily acted upon by microbes, and so it speeds decomposition. Not a good thing. We want to keep as much organic matter in the ground. Granted, when it breaks down, we're getting nutrients to our plant, but we want to maintain it as long as possible. Tillage also destroys aggregation. One of the positive things of all of that soil microbiological community is that They are producing glues in an instance of a lot of those bacteria that are gluing soil particles together loosely. We have fungal species that are forming fungal threads or hyphae that is kind of tying particles together. And over time, that increases aggregation, which is good. Aggregation is great in our soil. Again, it increases I should say increases pore space, not reduces. It increases pore space, which is where we have water and air stored, and increases water infiltration. So do make a note of that. That actually increases pore space, not reduces it. The other thing about tillage is it disrupts that biological community. So, if you're tilling 6 inches deep, you're taking soil at 6 inches deep, throwing it up on the surface of the soil. Chances are some of the microbes that are 6 inches deep are not going to survive being thrown up on top of the soil. By the same token, some of the ones on top of the soil probably aren't going to like conditions 6 inches deep. So we're really kind of upsetting that biological community if our goal is to have happy microbes. And a huge reason not to till, it brings weed seeds to the surface. So when we have seeds from weeds, they don't always germinate all together the next year. They're going to space themselves out. So only some of them will germinate. So that's why we get kind of the saying 1 year of weeds, 7 years of weeding. That's conservative. Weeds will literally last for decades in the soil, if not a century. And then once they're brought up, they'll grow. And so every time we till, we're digging up more soil, and we're actually bringing seeds to the surface. Or if we have seeds on the surface, we're burying those deeper so we can dig them up later. So tillage can kind of create a lot of weed problems. So if we can avoid tillage, we can actually start getting better handle on our weeds. And that's why a lot of small commercial operations really look at minimum or no tillage, especially on the organic side of production, because there's not a lot of tools to deal with weed control. And so the fewer options you have, maybe sometimes you've got to make sure you're not making your situation worse. So we want to avoid it. It has negative consequences for our soil health, but it's a tool. And it's a tool we do sometimes use in our gardens, and particularly when we're talking about cover cropping. It does do an excellent job of incorporating those cover crops and helping us to kill them effectively. And especially if we're starting a new garden in sod or things like that, tillage to first establish that garden area is a very reasonable use of this tool. So the way I look at it is why I want to avoid tillage. It's a tool we do sometimes need to use. We just have to understand the negatives of it so we don't overuse it. But I don't want to cast it in such a light to saying we should never use it. And certainly if the difference is I'm going to cover crop and till it under, or I'm not going to cover crop at all, I would definitely cover crop and till it under, because the negatives that you create with tilling by incorporating all that biomass of the cover crop, that's ameliorating that some. So I think we're probably ending up on the good side by using that tool to accomplish that. So do think about tillage as a possibility, even though we might want to limit it. So what do you plant? In large part, this is going to be sort of what's your goal for the cover crop. Is it just about creating that biomass that we're going to put back in the soil to increase organic matter? Are we particularly trying to put floral resources out there? Are we looking to get nitrogen from nitrogen fixation? And while some of these, these are not mutually exclusive, many of our cover crops will do one of these really, really well. Doesn't mean they don't necessarily do the others completely at all, but certainly we can do mixes where we work on the benefits of multiple different cover crops to help us hit more goals. So it's not an all or nothing thing, and that's great. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that the more and diverse species you have in a cover crop, the more benefits we have to the soil, because not every plant produces the same exact root exudates. And so some plants may feed certain species in our soil better than others. So having a mix is a good thing. An excellent book that is free of charge as a PDF is this book, Managing Cover Crops Profitably. As you can guess by the title, it is geared towards agriculture, not home gardeners, but the information in there is absolutely excellent. It's the best one-stop shop we have. I have some other resources that I'll send you by email for those online that they're good, but if there was one resource to look at, I would go with this. Excellent book. If we're looking at cover crops, we basically have three categories. Grasses, that includes our grains or cereals, as well as some that are not grains. And then legumes, these are plants that fix nitrogen by way of a symbiosis with rhizobium bacteria. So these are things like clovers, pea, vetch. There's some other minor things like sun hemp, as well as some others possibly that we could list there. But clovers, pea, and vetch are the main ones. And then we kind of have the other category. And so a lot of this are things like our brassicas, mustards, turnips, radishes. It's things like buckwheat. And so we do kind of have these three big categories. And again, they each kind of do different things better than others. I think in the home garden, it's not maybe as big a deal trying to zero in on one over the other, but certainly having a mix is great. So I talked about rhizobium bacteria. So I'm going to blame our elementary school teachers for a misunderstanding that I think some gardeners have. If you remember in elementary school, we learned all about the Three Sisters way of planting that Native Americans did, where they did corn, beans, and then squash. I've often heard people say, you know, well, they used the beans to fertilize the other crops, and the squash covered the ground, reduced sunlight, so you get fewer weeds. The thing to understand about rhizobium bacteria and plants, when you have these legumes that are inoculated or do have, kind of sounds bad to say it this way, but are infected with the bacteria, you get what you see there in the picture. You get nodules on the roots. So those round things that would be disturbing to find on roots, because you're like, roots aren't supposed to look like that. They will look like that if you have rhizobium bacteria colonizing them. Within those nodules, they are taking that atmospheric nitrogen and turning it into a form that's actually plant available. But what's not happening, that plant is not leaking all that nitrogen into the soil. That plant is using that nitrogen. So if we plant legumes mixed in with corn, we're not actually feeding nitrogen to the corn. That nitrogen only becomes available once that plant's dead and it gets broken down by the microbes. Then that nitrogen that we didn't harvest, and that's the other thing, we remove things when we harvest, but that nitrogen that's left behind is only available to plants once the microbes break it down. So we don't have a lot of nitrogen flowing into the ground while the plant is alive. So just understand about that and legumes. Not saying don't plant legumes, just understand it's not a free pump of nitrogen that we plant now and immediately get that nitrogen to the plant sitting next to it. We do sometimes want to think about utilizing an inoculant. And basically all an inoculant is a source of that rhizobium bacteria that would be specific to what we're planting. So not all species of rhizobium will affect all species of legumes. So the ones that we would use for clover would not necessarily do a good job with Austrian winter pea and vice versa. So this is something that at a gardener level, I think it's a little bit challenging just because there's not a lot of small necessarily quantity of inoculants available. Generally, they're $10 to $20. Isn't a huge amount of money, but chances are at a home garden, you're going to use a couple of tablespoons of the material. You're not going to use much of it. Certainly there's some benefit there, particularly if you've not grown legumes in the area before. And so, I don't think it's a bad idea. I don't think it means you can't plant legumes if you don't buy these inoculants. It's something to keep in mind. You can even buy inoculants for just your garden beans you're raising, and that may be a positive thing. But so you can, at a commercial level, lots of times you can find seed that already has a coating, which includes the inoculant in it. I do say seed or soil because you can find some inoculant materials that they say apply them to basically the ground to the furrow where you're planting things. Others, they say coat the seed. Follow the directions if you happen to buy one. And think about, because these are basically living materials, they do have expiration dates, and you wouldn't necessarily want to store them where you get temperature extremes, certainly not where it's very hot. So just understand that. So inoculants and legumes, it's that bacteria that does all the work that legumes get all the benefit from. But of course, the plant is providing that bacteria with all those carbohydrate resources that they're producing. So it's a good symbiosis. Both species benefit. That picture there is actually peanut roots. And so a legume, again, not necessarily one we grow often in our gardens, but that is what a well-colonized root system would look like. And if you break open those little nodules, you'll actually see red inside of them. I've mentioned it before, we're in a transition zone. So this was taken out of that Managing Cover Crops Profitably book. It shows south of us that we would grow Austrian winter pea as a winter annual. So we'd sow it in the fall. North of us, it's actually a summer annual because they get too cold. And we're in between. The only way we can, the way we get the most biomass out of an Austrian winter pea is by planting it in the fall. We'll talk more about that. We do have both warm season crops we can plant and cool season crops. So we can grow things in the middle of summer. So, growing something like a cowpea in the middle of the summer is a great way to grow a legume that's going to add nitrogen, have a lot of biomass. There's a bunch of other warm season things we can grow that wouldn't overwinter. So maybe we plant those late summer, have them winter kill. Maybe that's one way we do the winter kill option. But a lot of gardeners like the overwintering option because then it's not taking productive space away from our main growing season. And so for a lot of people, the overwinter option is probably the most attractive. And that's why I have this class now, this time of year, because it's right in time to do some of those overwintering options. One thing that I ran across, I thought was a little bit interesting and neat. It is the cover crop selector from covercropselector.org. Basically, the front screen, you put in your information, where you're located. It asks you a series of questions about, is your soil well drained? It first asks you your state, and then you need to put in your address, because for Tennessee, it defaults to Nashville if you don't put in your address. And it actually has Nashville at zone 6, and we're actually more of a zone 7. So if you utilize this tool, do pay attention to that. It asked about soil drainage. It estimates your first frost of the year being about October 14th. I think I used Jonesboro as my actual location on this one. That's about right. And then it has goals. So you can select, why are you growing the cover crop? Is it to fix nitrogen? Is it to have something winter kill? Is it to have the most biomass? And based on that, it provides you with a whole list, and it extended off the screen, of different things you could be planting. And what you have there on all those bars is basically when you can plant things, the particular crop in question. And so this is another way to have some of the same information that's available in the book form and some of the other resources as well. A little bit different, a little more interactive. And you can take a look at it that way. One thing that I circled there in red, it's Cover Crop Explorer. That's where you can actually click on that, and you can look at different things more closely. So if you don't know what spelt is, you can actually click there, bring up all the information on spelt, and spelt's actually a grain. And so you can look at that and see, okay, when would I use this, or would I want to use this, or whatever the case may be. So you can actually do that without going through all those questions. Not a lot of questions. It's only, I think, like 3 or 4, but you can actually get to that information by that tab. This is that tab expanded, and you see there where, based on your zone, it has a lot of information you can look through. Okay. So I thought we'd talk about a few crops that we commonly see used in our gardens as cover crops that I think are good ones. And that would even be possible to have planted this season. Excuse me. The first being buckwheat, which will winter kill for us. What's great about buckwheat, it is fast to flower. 25 days after planting, you're going to be seeing the first flowers. So certainly if you have 4 weeks of growing season left, maybe 5, if the soil's a little cooler and the seeds slow to come up, you can actually have this up and blooming in that amount of time. A good thing about it, depending on, or maybe negative, depending how you want to look at it, the residues don't last a long time. They're not very high in carbon. It's not like straw where it's going to lay there for a long time. It's going to break down quickly. So that's good if you're wanting to get back in there and plant things. Maybe not the best if you're wanting to have long-lasting coverage of that soil. It is a good floral resource. It does a good job with weed suppression if we sow it densely, because it will form a dense canopy like you see there. Termination is pretty easy on this one. It's easily killed by mowing. And certainly if we plant it about this time of year, we would probably expect it to winter kill pretty soon after it started flowering. If there's a negative, it's that it can self-sow. So then you have buckwheat coming up on its own volition. It's not too bad. It's not an overly aggressive weed. It's easily pulled if you want to remove it. And you are just having a little flowering plant pop up here and there. So it's certainly not a bad weed to have in the garden. Austrian winter pea, it's a type of field pea. And so it is a legume. So that gives us the nitrogen fixation with the rhizobium. We could get, if we planted nothing but the Austrian winter pea and it grew well, you could do 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre from this crop just by growing it. 100 pounds of nitrogen will grow most vegetable crops very well. On the higher end of production, when we're doing irrigation, we might do 125 to 150 on some vegetables, but if you've got 100 pounds there, you've got most crops well satisfied. And certainly for the home garden, it's probably a much higher rate than we see actually in home gardens. It is a winter annual for us. It's not going to tolerate the heat. It is a pea. So normally we plant this in the fall for overwintering. We very, very, very often mix it with a cereal. So something like winter wheat. I'll talk about why I'm not talking about rye in a minute. But we like to have a cereal with it because the upright growth of that grass, of that grain, helps it to survive better. It doesn't get as matted. So you can see there in the picture with that little plot, you can see where it's kind of growing up and utilizing that grass somewhat as support. So we actually get better survival with Austrian winter peas when it does have something else that can help support it. It's not difficult to kill. Certainly the mowing and turning over in a garden works well. We can do more physical things with this if we're at full bloom. So crimping is great at full bloom, disking through the field, various things like that at full bloom works really well. But this is not one that prior to full bloom, we would mow and expect it to kill it completely. So this is one that physical cutting and then turning over, disrupting the root system works well for it in the garden scenario if we can't wait till full bloom to do it. Winter wheat, same picture, but the other one in the picture. So we're talking about a grass. I love having grasses in a rotation because other than corn, we really don't grow grasses in our garden. So if we're talking about rotating between crop families, throwing a grass in there is great. Winter annual, again, as the name kind of clues you in, we plant this in the fall. This absolutely does grow wheat that we make bread from if you want to. So if you want to grow grain, you can do that. In our neck of the woods, we do grow winter wheat, not spring wheat like they would grow up north. We can use it as a solitary thing. It wasn't uncommon back when we grew a lot of tobacco that a whole lot of tobacco fields had winter wheat growing on them after the tobacco came out. It was a way to capture those nutrients, hold it there, everything we've talked about them doing. They used to do it. Cover crops are not new, but they are a great tool. Termination, if we are doing physical means, like, rolling, crimping, or just mowing, you basically have to wait till you start getting that head formation and the grain is at the milk stage. Again, in our area, I feel that's a little late depending on what you're wanting to do. So certainly maybe part of the crop, if you have winter wheat there, could be done later because maybe you're not planting the entire garden beginning in early spring. but there are going to be areas that things like mowing alone or rolling crimping isn't going to work well for. And so again, that's where the cutting and physical disruption of the soil works well. So why not cereal rye? And that's to distinguish it from the more turf or type ryes. Why not rye? Basically, it grows too fast, too early. And so even a lot of small commercial operations, back now about 15 years ago, I went to a conference and they had some organic growers, and they were basically training extension and NRCS personnel. And like all the ones talking, nobody was using rye. The reason rye gets mentioned a lot is because it has a fairly strong allelopathic effect. And so allelopathy is just where plants will produce chemicals that inhibit other plants. And so what's great about rye is you use it as a cover crop, it can actually prevent seed germination. Now, that's not great if you're trying to plant seeds to germinate, but if you're transplanting into a rye cover crop, that's awesome because that's keeping other weeds away. But the challenge with it is if you have hand tools or you have, the small scale rototiller, not tractor mounted implements, it can get away from you in the spring, particularly if we have a wet spring. You get so much growth that it just becomes a bear to kill. And so this is one that use caution if you're going to use rye. Nothing wrong with it other than sometimes it gets away from us. And so because of that, I don't like to recommend it. I think wheat is a great substitute. Generally speaking, winter wheat's very easily accessible too. And so I don't know that rye has anything going for it, given the caveats to it. That being said, if you want to use it, nothing wrong with it. The using cover crops profitably has information in it on it. It's not hard to find. But again, if someone asked me for my recommendation, I would not recommend our cereal rye. Other good options. So we are getting probably a little late to plant some of these, not saying you couldn't, but the brassicas like mustards, turnips, and radishes, you could certainly still plant them. They'll germinate, they'll grow. They're just not going to give us the full biomass volume they would have if we had planted them 3 weeks ago, for instance. So to me, I'd like to see these in the ground by September 1st, probably, maybe even a little bit earlier. And so we are middle of September, so it's not the worst thing in the world if you want to give these a try, if you want to use them as part of a mix. Generally speaking, most of these should winter kill. There might be some survivors, so that's one caveat to it. We do have options with the brassica family that are interesting, things like tillage radishes, which basically are a daikon radish. If you're not familiar with daikon radish, this isn't your salad radish. These are Asian radishes. They have big, large tap roots. Some of them can be very large and very deep. And we like them because they're going so deep in the soil and basically leaving these large voids. It can help compacted soils. And so they're good to have as part of a mix or as part of a program. We can just substitute in, something like purple top turnips. You don't have to necessarily go. Some of the tillage radishes that are specifically marketed as tillage radishes are very expensive when you look at the seed. A daikon radish is a real close cousin, and it's a lot cheaper. So just keep that in mind. Not to say the tillage radishes aren't cool. I think there's one company that markets them under groundhog even. But they do a good job, but there might be a cheaper option that, especially in a home garden, probably does just as well. One neat thing I like about cover crops is it lets me use manures more easily. If we are thinking about food safety and untreated manures, raw manures, even manures we compost at home, but we don't actually allow temperatures on, we always want to make sure we use those with a good amount of time between application and the harvest of anything. So if we look to organic regulations, they have the 90 and 120 day rule. And what it says, if a crop is well up off of the soil where there's minimal chance of soil splash, you need to apply and incorporate manures at minimum 90 days prior to harvest. If it's in close contact with the soil, 120 days before harvest. So that's where I came up with the 120-day rule. It's kind of a default food safety rule currently because there's nothing more specific. If we're utilizing cover crops, we can actually be putting manure on our cover crop in fall and in winter. Normally, we wouldn't want to do that because we don't have something growing there. That means that manure we're applying to the surface could become runoff and enter into streams, and that's not good. So using a cover crop means we can have these raw manures, apply them to the cover crop. They're going to use those nutrients. They're going to take them up. And because of the timing, we're not worried about microbes because we're not going to have anything within 120 days of that application that we're harvesting. So that's one reason why I like cover crops too. I can utilize raw manures without going through any sort of steps just by timing their application for the cover crop rather than the crop I'm harvesting. And so I think that's definitely a positive element. Maybe we don't think of a lot, but if you want to use manures, that's a great way. Now, could there be negatives with cover crops? Yes. So one thing that you might find out is cover crops can be attractive to wildlife. So you may have wildlife coming in. And so the question is, does that habituate those deer or rabbits or whoever to come back when you're planting your main season crops? I don't know. That's a good question. I think it's a real possibility if they get used to, hey, I can eat here all the time. So that may be something to think about. And so maybe think of some way to deter that. Another thing to be aware of, particularly brassicas, when they're decomposing after a winter kill, if you have a large brassica population, because they have sulfur-containing compounds, they can stink. So if you have a lot of brassicas and you have close neighbors, they may smell something. That may smell like a cover crop working for you. They may think it smells like something else. So just be aware that's a possibility. The other thing that can happen is that incomplete termination. We don't kill them all, or winter doesn't kill them all. And so now this cover crop might become in competition with the other crops we want to grow. And so when I have something in competition with my crops that I am growing, that's a weed. So there is the possibility that you have to deal with it, and again, it's not overwhelming. These are not plants that are going to take over your garden. It's not kudzu, it's not peppermint. They're better behaved than that, but realistically, there can be hiccups and you might have to come back and address it again. I don't think cost, especially on the garden scale, is a realistic negative. The challenge might be access. Sometimes these can be hard to find. And so I did try to do a little bit of calling around today to see what might be available. Last year up in Gray, the Ace Hardware, was it Kurt's or Curtis's Ace Hardware there in Gray? They had both Austrian winter pea and winter wheat. Called them today. They said they hadn't got it in yet. So, but they told me on the phone they'd had several people asking. So I'm thinking, I hope that means you'll get it. But so that was one that, and especially when you can buy it in small amounts, because we'll talk about here in a minute how much we would actually use for a garden. It's not a lot. So we don't want to have to buy in a 50-pound bag from somewhere. That's unrealistic. You're not going to probably do it if that's the case. Not because of cost, but then what do you do with the other 49.5 pounds of wheat you have? And so I think access is probably a bigger negative than cost, but this could be something where, you can order in something small, especially if you're wanting to try some of the more uncommon things, and maybe split it among gardening friends, encourage them, make that, a Labor Day present for people, start a new trend, Labor Day gifts, cover crops. But, certainly I think that can be access is a negative for us. Planting is not something super technical. Basically, we want to remove the crop debris. So whatever was there before, if we have a heavy mulch, we probably want to move that out of the way. And the reason is we need good seed to soil contact. So if we're not tilling, again, tillage might be used, but if we're not tilling, rake the area well, just kind of work the dirt up and then sow it by hand. Broadcasting is good. You do not have to use a seeder like I have there in the picture. For most home gardens, that would be ridiculous to use. You'll spend more time working out, getting it adjusted rather than just throwing it out there by hand. Throwing it out there by hand works great. We can actually be a little more methodical with this and kind of seed in rows. Don't have to, but you can. And then we just kind of lightly cover that seed. We can rake it. You know, if we're talking about larger areas, we may talk about running a harrow over it or a disc very lightly. We're not going to do that in a vegetable garden ordinarily. So just raking it lightly so it's covered. You could water it in. You probably don't have to this time of year. We'll probably be getting rain, you know, within a few days after you sow it. But certainly if it looks like you're going to have a dry spell, you might water it in. But it's a lot of these are larger seeds. So a lot of our wheat and peas and things like that. One year when I was in Kentucky, we were doing some cover cropping things and we sowed it and then we didn't get rain for like 3 weeks. It still came up. It just came up late. So, I mean, a lot of these seeds are pretty tough. So that's the good thing about some of these cover crops. They're not real finicky. So it's not the hardest thing in the world to plant. One thing we can do with sort of doing it in rows rather than just a true broadcast is we could select some areas for those winter kill crops. And so that means those would die, they'd be decomposing, and then they'd be open for our early spring crops. So I mentioned earlier, it's not an all or nothing. You don't have to plant exactly the same things everywhere. You can have areas you do different things, see what you like, what you enjoy, or just like this, make some areas available. Now, obviously, you can just skip those areas and not plant. I know that, I'm not an idiot, but I don't want bare soil there. I want something else. So having a cover crop that's going to grow and then get winter killed is better than leaving it bare soil. If the winter kill isn't a good option, then think about mulching it. If you're going to be moving leaves in the home landscape, put them on the garden. Leaves breaking down is a positive thing for our gardens. It's a source of organic matter and nutrients. So my suggestions for where we're at this season, I would say look at focusing on winter wheat or a mix of winter wheat and Austrian winter pea. One of the reasons I say that is I'm not super certain how available these are. I believe Co-op does have Austrian winter pea available here in Jonesboro. Not certain if they have winter wheat right now. So that would be another place to look. I would encourage you before you make a trip somewhere, give them a call, ask them what they have, and ask them if you can buy it by the pound. Because again, a bag of winter wheat will probably cost you less than $20 for 50 pounds. You don't need that much, and you're going to have to find something to do with it. So it's much better to buy just the amount you need rather than having a huge bag that you don't know what to do with. I would tell you to get these broadcast and raked into the garden no later than October 10th. Earlier is better. You're just getting more plant growing before cold weather gets here. But I think if you're in the ground by October 10th, it'll be okay. And I've certainly sown them that late and been okay with it. And again, the worst case scenario is you don't get as much growth in the spring. You have a smaller plant. So it's not terrible. So I'd rather have a late sown crop than nothing at all. Again, something's better than nothing. But if you can get them in the ground early October, that's the best thing to do. I like winter wheat and Austrian winter pea because they are tough plants. They're easy to grow. They're not finicky. Most of the time we can find winter wheat locally and Austrian winter pea as well. They're not too exotic. Certainly you can find things like turnips or mustards just for that fall garden. If you have some of that seed left over, want to include it, you can. I would get those in the ground sooner rather than later. That was going to be my focus, just because I do think we're kind of on the outside edge of them. We're not going to get as much growth, and particularly if we have a December freeze like we did last year, they're going to get winter killed. So that's something just to be aware of. So how much do we actually use? If I was doing a wheat winter pea mix, just one second.
Never mind.
Okay, we're back. All right. So what rate do we use? So 1,000 square foot area, I'd probably say we need 11 ounces of winter wheat and 6 ounces of Austrian winter peas. So less than a pound of both of them. and you put them together, you're barely over a pound of material that you're applying to 1,000 square feet. There's plenty of gardens that are not 1,000 square feet. So I just kind of did math on what would about be the average weight per pound of these two. And we're looking probably about 3 or 4 Austrian winter peas and maybe 12 winter wheat seed per square foot. So if you've got a 4x8 garden bed that's 32 square feet, you can say you need 100 pea seed. And you need 360 wheat seed. Not a lot, basically. And so, I mean, that's it. You can do the math from the ounces to the square footage that you have, but it's not a lot. We do kind of probably err on the side of sowing things a little heavy, just because, especially if we're not tilling or doing anything like that, it is very possible that we don't have the best seed to soil contact and maybe not the greatest germination. Broadcasting is not the way to conserve seed. We sow heavier when we broadcast than if we are drilling or if you're hand seeding and poking things into the soil. So if there is a doubt, I'd probably say put a little extra as opposed to a little too little. The other thing is, I'm not worried if these are overcrowded, because biomass is biomass, whether it's 5 plants that weigh a pound or 20 plants that weigh a pound. A pound of biomass is a pound of biomass from a soil health perspective, in my opinion. So I think, while I don't want to overdo it too much, if you're a little bit over, if you're just estimating weights, I think you'll be okay. If I was doing winter wheat alone, and I probably would not recommend Austrian winter pea alone, just because I don't think it'll have as great a survival, I would look at doing about 22 ounces per 1,000 square feet or 24 seeds per square foot. Now, again, I don't expect anybody to count seeds for a cover crop, but just to give you an idea, it's a small amount we're talking about on a square foot basis. So when you have that 16 or 30 square foot bed, it's not a huge amount. We're talking a handful. Okay. So with that, I will open it up to questions.